Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise. We have a very specific mission. Our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. The TTF has been around since 2015, and being quite frank about it, over the years we have started to become more and more concerned about the decay of the trustworthiness in our institutions. In fact, on Tuesday next week, we have a related event to today's. The event we're running on Tuesday next week is all about state capture, the idea that the institutions in our society are really failing at a systemic level to do what they are meant to do. So today's event, which as you know is all about Martin Wolf's book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, is at a kind of essential level of enormous interest to the Transparency Task Force community, which for those of you who don't know amounts to approximately 6,000 people in 21 countries around the world, mostly in the UK, but clearly we do have an international dimension too. So a little bit about Martin's book, and then I'll be passing over to Martin. He'll speak for maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. We'll then be hearing some opinions from various parliamentarians who very kindly have joined today's session as well. And then, time permitting, we'll throw things open for a more general discussion about that. So, about Martin's book. The commentary is that we are living in an age when economic failings have shaken faith in global capitalism. Political failings have undermined trust in liberal democracy and in the very notion of truth. Sometimes people say that we're in the post-truth era, don't they? The ties that ought to bind open markets to free and fair elections are being strained and rejected, even in democracy's notional heartlands. That, of course, includes the UK. Around the world, democratic capitalism, which depends on the determined separation of power from wealth, is in crisis. Some now argue that capitalism is better without democracy. Others that democracy is better without capitalism. The book that we're going to be hearing from Martin about is a forceful rejoinder to both of those views. It analyzes how the marriage between capitalism and democracy has become so fraught, and yet insists that a divorce would be an almost unimaginable calamity. So, having set the scene very briefly, and to give us as much time as possible to hear from the man himself, I'm going to invite Martin to pick up from there. Martin, thank you so much for being with us. This is really a tremendously popular book and very, very relevant to the cause of the Transparency Task Force. We're ever so grateful for you for setting aside some time to speak to us today. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And I think you've already pretty well explained what the book's about. I should say before I start, perhaps partly because of the number of such events I've been doing, my voice is somewhat strained, and I apologize if I hope it won't happen if I start losing it in the middle of this discussion. So I'm going to simply explain relatively briefly why I wrote this book and what, in broad outline, it argues, and then leave it to others to comment. It's unfortunately a pretty big book. There are about 380 pages of actual text. It's not as big as it looks because a lot of footnotes and bibliographical references and there's a long index, but still it's quite a lot. The only defense I can make is it's a good deal shorter than the first draft. So I'm not going to be able to explain in full all the evidence and arguments I have. It has about 50 charts, and it's a typically laborious Martin Wolf product. Now, why did I write this book? I mean, that's important because it was very difficult for me to do, because it takes me very far outside my normal comfort zone, deep into politics. And I don't regard myself beyond having a reasonably well-informed amateur interest and having studied politics as part of my degree at Oxford, as in any way expert. So I was forced to read a great deal and think a great deal about areas of our lives that I hadn't done before. And in particular, I had to think a great deal about how our economic organization is related to our political organization as societies. And in the process, I realized something really pretty important, which is that trying to combine a democratic political system with a market economy is novel, revolutionary, what you might say, development of the last couple of centuries, and it's very difficult to do. It's a very problematic relationship, and I'll come to that in a moment. So that's the background. I started being interested in this topic over the last 10 years or so, but I decided to write about it only in 2016, and I don't think it's very difficult to understand why. That was the trigger year. And of the two important political events at that time, the emergence of Donald Trump as the standard bearer for the Republican Party in the US was, in my mind, a far more significant event than the local Brexit event. But what was clear in both cases is that there was a lively repudiation of the establishments of both countries, of these two ancient countries. And this then led me to think, well, how far can this go? And what sort of transformation might we see? And why is it happening? What is happening? That then led me to what is the second part of the book, which is a discussion of the relationship between the market economy and democracy. Just to make clear, I can't explain all this in full. I define capitalism as a competitive market economy, with defended private property, dependent on the rule of law, to some degree internationally open, and above all open to the entry of new businesses, new enterprises created by new competitors. And I define liberal democracy, which I think is the only form of democracy that means anything, as one, again, based on the rule of law, with defended electoral processes in which victories are temporary and regarded as legitimate, and oppositions are legitimate and allowed to oppose and to campaign for power, and again defended through the existence of private property, which can be used to support them, and independent media of various kinds. So liberal democracy is an outgrowth of a liberal society. And illiberal democracy, which we've heard a lot about recently, is a form of autocracy, and it's not democracy at all. These two systems have obvious things in common. They require an independent rule of law, which defends people from coercion, both private and public. And it depends on a whole range of constraining institutions, norms, and values to allow these systems work. But there is something quite paradoxical in the emergence of democratic capitalism, which is what we are trying to do is historically unnatural, or at least historically exceptional among organized societies in pre-modern times, which is to separate economic wealth, the control over resources, from political power, so that the powerful are not necessarily the wealthy, and vice versa. And to a remarkable degree, we do achieve that. But of course, that separation is incredibly difficult. And there are two natural and historically precedented ways democracies collapse. One is into autocracy, and the most obvious way, already defined by Plato in his Republic, is into an autocracy which takes over the institutions of republican or democratic rule and converts them into instruments of centralized power. And we're seeing this in so many countries across the world that I don't even need to point that out. And the other possibility, which we're certainly seeing, is plutocracy, in which the power, the wealth is converted into political power in many different ways, through lobbying, through the purchase of politics, through political influence and so forth. And we end up with a predatory form of oligarchy, which Aristotle calls plutocracy. And it's these two outcomes, historically precedented, and I think it's pretty obvious that they're present today. We are living in an era of what Larry Diamond of Stanford, a doyen of students of this subject, calls a democratic recession. And you can see that in many analyses, which I cite in my book, of the erosion of democratic political institutions across the world, including in high-income countries, notably including the US, and even worse, a clear erosion in opinion polls, world value surveys, and so forth, of belief in and support for democracy, again across the world, but including in countries like our own, and notably including among younger people. So the system has lost legitimacy. Now, this then raises a question, which is the core of the book, is why that has happened and what's that meant for politics. And I focus, because I'm an economist, I'm not saying it's the only thing that matters, but it seems to me crucial, on economics. It seems to me that there are obvious ways in which the emergence of capitalism created the demand for and the opportunity for a democratic, a surge of democratic values and ultimately democracy itself. Remember, 230 years ago, there were essentially no countries in the world anybody could regard as democratic. They were all narrow oligarchies or monarchies of various kinds. And I argue, I won't have the time to go through this at length now, that the forces capitalism generated both directly and indirectly, directly through rising living standards, urbanization, industrialization, and indirectly through the creation of an organized working class, trades unions, increasing education, crucial for the development of the capitalist economy itself, led to the emergence of institutional and individual pressures to include more and more people into the populace. No doubt total war was part of that. I discussed that briefly. That has, by the way, as Greek precedents, ancient Greek precedents. And by the early 20th century, many developed countries had become universal suffrage democracies. This one, of course, in 1930, when finally all adult women became electors. So that was the great achievement. And by and large, in the 20th century, despite the many challenges, democracy did pretty well. And I still believe, I don't have the time to go into this now, that it's the best system we know of in the world for combining individual liberty, political freedoms, and prosperity. But this hasn't gone so well. And I think this has happened for several reasons. The most important, I think, for our societies, I can't go through all of them now, is deindustrialization, which was a massive long-term trend in all developed countries over the last 40 or 50 years. The loss of the know-how that gave developed countries their unique position in the world economy to the rest of the world, all completely natural, linked to but not dependent on globalization, the rise of China and other emerging economies, new competitors, which transformed our economy structurally and particularly badly affected the industrial working class and the regions in which of our societies, it's all over the developed world, which was most deeply engaged in industry. If you look at our so-called left behind regions, They're basically the old industrial areas of our economy. In addition, on many dimensions, rising inequality to the very, very top, the top 1% and 0.1%, but also very significantly a shift in income towards graduates and people with and an enormous expansion in the graduate share of our employment, with the most successful of whom did very well, with declining relative incomes in the middle of the bottom and growing insecurity for many people with precarious jobs, the emergence of the precariat, as Guy Standing describes it, emerging. Now, in this period, there were actually some giant global advances, which I don't think we should forget. And the most obvious is a simply staggering reduction in global poverty as countries like China and India began to grow so rapidly. So there were gains over this period, but these were huge shocks. Then, and I think it was a crucial event, I discussed this at length, there was a massive financial crisis. I can't discuss, because my previous book does, how that happened, how the financial crisis fits into this story, but the consequence of the financial crisis, I think, was devastating to the political legitimacy of our system, particularly in this country, in the US, because they were the center of the world financial system. And the most important points were, it was a huge shock economically. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that the people in charge of the financial system, which included government, regulators, and the financial system in itself, the court, didn't know what they were doing, and they were rescued on a colossal and extraordinary scale. And there was a big short-term reduction in real income, but more importantly, subsequently, and I show this at length, in every developed country, but particularly in the UK, growth slowed dramatically. So my favorite statistic in this, I'll just give you this. Today, in 2022, real GDP per head in the UK is 30% less than it would have been if the 1990 to 2007 trend had continued. No wonder we're fighting a zero-sum political battle right now between the demand for cushioning shocks to living standards when they've been stagnant for so long. At the same time, it's so obvious we need to spend more on our public sector, and our politicians don't know what to do about this. I think this longer term trends combined with this shorter term shock led a great many of people in our societies, particularly the non-university educated, to look for saviors, look for somebody who wasn't part of this apparently corrupt ruling elite or incompetent ruling elite, and they lighted on successful populists, very different sorts of populists. Donald Trump and Boris Johnson are very different. But it's important then, and I will conclude with this because I don't have time to go on to what I think should be done about it and how this can be sorted out. But the crucial point, why is populism dangerous and what can we do about it? My view, and this is based on a lot of reading and thinking, is that we can think of populism as two sorts of things which are connected. One is actually both comprehensible and valuable in situations like this. It's populism as anti-elitism. It's populism as saying that the elites, the establishment have let us down, we need new leaders. And the best example of a populist demagogue of this kind in the last 130 years is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you read his texts, they were classic demagoguery, but he knew why and what he was trying to do it for. He was very, very good at bringing in highly competent people to make his new administration, his New Deal work. That sort of populism is valuable. Unfortunately, most populist leaders in most countries, most of the time, Latin America is the object lesson, are incompetent, and they don't know how to govern, and they make a mess of things. And then you get into what I think of as the populist cycle, which is not necessarily vicious, but it's a cycle of failure. The most dangerous form of populism, and I think it's the form we've seen with Trump and may see again, is populism that is not just anti-elitist, but anti-pluralist. That is populists who say, I represent you, the real people, and the people who don't support me are not part of the real people, they're enemies of the people. And there's a lot of that sort of rhetoric about. You can see it in regimes like Hungary's, in the regimes like Turkey's. You see it of a lot of other politicians, and Trump has definitely gone in that direction. And this is fundamentally anti-democratic. It's a precursor of autocracy. So I'll conclude that that's where I think we are. Fortunately, the indulgence in anti-pluralist rhetoric was there a bit in the Brexit campaign and afterwards, but I think has faded in Britain. So we're just dealing with the residue of populism. But a fundamental point remains in both countries, that, in my view, that unless we generate economic stability and economic progress, which is obviously relevant to the great majority of people, there's a risk, I think almost a certainty, that these political pressures will re-emerge, and the legitimacy of our combination of democracy and the market economy will continue to be in doubt. And another 10, 15 years of zero real growth of living standards in our society will, I think, be very difficult for our political system to cope with. Thank you for listening.
Martin, thank you. I think everybody would like to show our appreciation to what you've said, and of course for writing your book before we move on. So can I please invite everybody to do just that? Martin, thank you very, very, very much indeed. It's a real pleasure listening to somebody with such incision and such a big picture view of things. It really is, Martin. Thank you. I'm going to indulge with a couple of quick questions myself, please, before we pass on to Lords Alderdice, Oates and Kamal. We'll go in the order of Lord Kamal, Lord Alderdice and then Lord Oates, and then Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. Then perhaps some other parliamentarians before we opening up to everybody else. This first question is actually quite bleak, if I'm frank about it. If we were to see the ongoing decay of the quality of our democracy and standards and trust in institutions, is it conceivable to you, sir, that we could end up with riots on the street type situations, even in stable countries like the UK? Is this where this could go?
Well, my starting point, as I explain in my preface and in the article I wrote for the FT about the book, is inevitably and electably informed by personal history. I was born in this country, but my parents were, as so many people are now here, were refugees. Well, they were refugees from Hitler. My father was Austrian, my mother was from Holland, and they fled in fear of their lives from the most demonic anti-pluralist populist in the history of the world, I would say, Adolf Hitler. And he was much more than that. Of course, I understand this. So it is important to remember, and I point this out, that in the early 20th century, nobody would have imagined, even though Germany was still a monarchy, that any such thing could happen in what was one of the most advanced and sophisticated societies in the world, with probably the most highly educated population of any major industrial country. So the thing I take from this is we must never assume the stability of our institutions' arrangements. And I reinforce that by pointing out, and it needn't be pointed out, there's a long history of revolutionary collapse and civil war, even here, though thank God a very long time ago, but crucially, as I argue at great length in the book, this combination of a democratic political system with its fundamentally egalitarian principles, political principles, with a market economy is incredibly delicate and fragile. And And that's sort of just obvious when you really start analyzing it. I only started analyzing it for this book because up to now, to my great shame, I sort of took it for granted. But these developments, particularly in America, so crucial for us all, the bastion of democracy in the 20th century, showed how fragile they are. So my view is that it is sensible for people to understand that anything can happen. It is sensible for people to realize that people, I wouldn't say like us, but certainly like me, in positions like this, as I said, broadly speaking, the establishment are not trusted in our societies in the way we would like, and certainly not in the way they were in my youth after the Second World War, when politicians had overwhelmingly served in the war as part of a national effort and enterprise, and seemed more plausibly committed to broad social welfare. So the erosion of confidence very clearly shown in these well-value surveys and other surveys show is really quite deep, and it seems to be particularly significant in the less wealthy parts of our country. Many of that comes out in cultural forms and among the young, which is really terrifying because they are the future. Now, I don't think riots are the core of this. The truth is, societies like ours can repress riots of even of quite large numbers of people. We've seen that. What happens, what is far more dangerous, is if truly irresponsible demagogues become the dominant players in political life. So I'll just give you some examples of where these risks arise. Take France, completely different story. The political parties of France have collapsed as institutions. That's not happened here yet. That means, and political parties are unbelievably important to stabilizing institutions of democratic politics. That means that the victors of French elections are and are going to be charismatic individuals. And Macron, fortunately, is a relatively benign version of such a thing. But once the victor of your election is going to become a charismatic individual, it could be anybody, right? It just requires a charismatic individual. The truth is that the great victor of the last 12 years of politics in Britain, the post-crisis years of politics in Britain until a few months ago, was our most charismatic politician. And that's Boris Johnson. He simply was our most charismatic politician, which is why he won. Fortunately for us, he's a hopeless policymaker, as we know, not very honorable, in my view. And he was found out, and the system has been strong enough to see him off. But that's the real danger. And we can never assume it. In America, it's still very likely that Donald Trump will be the next presidential candidate, and similar people may emerge. So the great danger is not, I think, riots in the street, though they may be an element. The great danger is the capture of politics by a charismatic demagogue. And this is happening all over the world. It could happen in our country. Democracy has always been vulnerable to that. You only need to read Plato and Aristotle to realize that. And that's what happens when institutionalized leadership and the institutions they dominate and control and influence have lost the trust of the great majority of the people. And I'm not saying we're there, but we're much closer to there than I would have imagined 20 years ago.
Martin, that's a fascinating answer. My final bit of input before we pass over to Lord Kamal. Within the Transparency Task Force, we often talked about the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and exposing things that aren't right. And we often refer to the pretty famous Robert F. Kennedy quotation about the importance of speaking up and speaking out. And if you don't, there'll be pain further down the road. How important is it that we as ordinary citizens do continue to speak up and speak out when we see things going wrong? For example, when we see the regulatory framework not doing what it's supposed to do to protect consumers from mis-selling by banks and other institutions, just to pick that out as an example. How important is it that we stand up rather than stand by?
I think an engaged citizenry, so my book ends up as sort of a paean to not where I thought I would end up, but the paean to the ideal of citizenship. So, this is hardly a new idea. Democracy needs citizens, and democracies are controlled by citizens, and we have to take seriously. And this is some very controversial things, I suspect, on some areas like immigration, when you consider that. But the basic point is it requires an engaged citizenry. If we, and I think this is something I hadn't thought before. So 50 years ago, 40 years ago, I used to think of trades unions as essentially institutions engaged in the economy and often quite problematic. What I didn't realize is they were absolutely essential political institutions, because they were a way of bringing a very large number of quite ordinary people together with enough mass to represent themselves in politics. That's been atomized. And that's why, instead of that, we have social media, interaction of social media, which creates hysterical groups, paranoid. The sort of people in America get all their news from Fox. Now, this is terrifying. It maximizes the possibility of demagogic engagement with people like Trump. Now, so to get to your point, if we don't have honest media, very difficult issue, which I do address, and we don't have means for ordinary people in association with one another to find out what's going on and to engage with it, our democracy gets fundamentally hollowed out. I have quite a bit on that at various stages in my book, probably not enough because it's not a core thing I know about, but I'm absolutely convinced that's essential. So one of the things, so it's just one thing, it's not directly to you, I think we have to clean up radically is the finance of political parties. And it's nothing like as big a problem here as it is in America, where it's just devastating what the Supreme Court has allowed to happen in terms of secret, completely non-transparent funding of political parties, political activities without limit by the wealthy. But it's even here, it's a very, very big issue. We need transparency in our politics. We need transparency in our tax system. Most people don't understand how unjust our tax system has become, and many, many similar issues. And this can be rescued, I hope. I may be very naive because it's not my area, of course, but rescued by understanding the absolute centrality of the notion of an engaged citizenry to any form of democracy. So let me just conclude with this. One of the ideas I push very, very hard is the idea of citizens' juries on consider serious and contentious issues. I even consider and engage with the idea of having a House of Parliament which is selected by lot. I think it's a good idea. I don't expect it to happen. But I think we need the voices of ordinary people, and we need ordinary people to feel, by ordinary people, I mean people who are not a part of the obvious elites, to feel that this country or any democracy belongs to them. And it's much easier in small countries like Denmark to do that. In here, it's almost impossible in the US, but it's something we have to try. By the way, one little bit of that is we have to decentralize government in Britain. Government in Britain is just ludicrously over-centralized, and everybody knows this, except the Treasury, which needs to be blown up, but that's another story.
The idea of blowing up the Treasury resonates quite well with me.
I have a long war with the Treasury.
We're going to...
as I can say, because I'm moderately competent in this area, I have a fundamental view is that the Treasury is always wrong.
Sounds like a pretty good default position to me, Martin. Thank you so much.
This
is really interesting.
Anyway,
really interesting. We're now going to hear briefly from Lords Cabal, Alderdice and Oates, and then Baroness Bennett. So, Lord Kamal, I believe you're with us. Please do take the opportunity to take yourself off mute and share your thought, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you just put a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Great. I'm coming at this from two angles. I'm a professor of politics and international relations, but I was also a former academic and research director at a classical liberal free market think tank. And I completely agree about the issue of capitalism. I'm a bit more limited in my definition of capitalism. I just tend to say it as based around private ownership of capital, and it's associated with free enterprise, but not always. And this is, I think, where the debates start. On the right, we quite often accuse our friends who are socialists who say, well, real socialism has never been tried. And they can throw the same thing back at us and say, well, you keep saying real capitalism has never been tried. And it's one of the self-criticisms of capitalism, if you like, is that I think we've got into a situation, we've got crony capitalism rather than free market capitalism. My friends on the left would disagree with that, but I think there's a distinction to be made. And there's two things I find fascinating about. One is the rent seeking, the lobbying and the companies that get regulation that suits them and keeps out competitors and startups, etc. And the second one is corporate welfare. So even though someone like me would not instinctively be seen to agree with the Occupy movement, and even though I don't share their hygiene habits, for example, I would completely agree with their protests against the sort of corporate welfare we saw of the banking sector. Now, you have to talk about what was needed in the aftermath of the crisis and all the instruments that blew up all these institutions. But you can understand why people get angry when they're worried about some money for just to live on a daily basis, and you see the banks get these millions and billions, and no one went to jail for any of this. And I just think what we have seen is too much corporate welfare and rent seeking. One quick example also is that legislation doesn't always help. Sometimes it makes it worse. So right in the European Parliament, we did some legislation on basic bank accounts for people who couldn't get access to bank accounts. And we forced the banks to offer people basic bank accounts. What we didn't do, maybe what we should have done, was encourage the space for competitors to banks, credit unions and others, rather than forcing banks to offer accounts to poorer people, which squeeze out the credit unions. So sometimes the actions of governments make this make all this much worse than it is. Those are my initial thoughts, and I'll let others come in. Thank you.
Lord Kamal, thank you very much indeed. Martin, would you like to respond to it?
Yeah, I just want to make one point. I couldn't discuss this, but Lord Kamal will be pleased to know that there is a very long section in my book on rentier capitalism or rigged capitalism, which focuses on competition policy, the emergence of monopoly, regulatory capture, the capture of the tax system, which is crucial, regulatory, the financial sector. I've done a lot of that in my previous book. So on this, we're completely on the same page.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's worth buying the book just for the section on regulatory capture. That's a topic of enormous interest to the Transparency Task Force. It really is. Thank you, Lord Kamal. Let's go to Lord Alderdice. Your thoughts, please, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy, and thank you very much, Martin. This is the second time I've heard Martin presenting on the book, previously in the FT event at the end of January, and he is absolutely one of my favourite columnists. But if I try to take forward some of the thinking, first of all, I think the analysis in the book is absolutely superb. And I would go along with a great deal of what he says about the reason we're in the difficulties. If I was, however, to put a bit of a caveat on it, I would say, as he himself has said, it is heavily weighted towards the economic. And whilst the economic problems that we face are a major problem, humanity is not a solely economic animal. And we very often find ourselves doing things which are not in our best socio-economic interests, but we do them because we believe in them, or we're committed to them, or we fear that our culture is being destroyed, or our identity erased, or whatever. And I think that that's a very important element of it too. We do face, and it's not for the first time, this coming together of a profound and well-based sense of the corruption of elites, a loss of values and ethics and a sense of truth from them. Secondly, a sense that the elites don't actually understand what's happening because there are changes taking place in knowledge and society that is leaving them behind. I often sit in the chamber in the Lords when there's things coming through, perhaps on the development of technology. And I know very well that many colleagues are finding it difficult to keep up with what's happening. And the structure of legislation, by the time you've brought a bill through Parliament, it's already out of date if it's dealing with some of the changes. And thirdly, of course, on that front, the emergence of disruptive technology. Disruptive technologies 500 years ago was the invention of printing. The kind of disruptive technologies that we have now are actually taking us beyond what human beings can easily cope with. For example, the speed of decision-making in the use of artificial intelligence during war, the decision-making about whether or not to fire a missile is happening at an extraordinary pace and very difficult to contain. What this leads me to really is in the sections where Martin is pointing up potential, if not solutions, at least ways forward. I have a great deal of sympathy with the idea that we need a very serious rebooting of the rules-based international liberal order with those who are prepared to cooperate. So a little bit like what Anders Fogh Rasmussen in Denmark has been talking about, an alliance of democracies that try to bed things down and hold on. But I don't, and I think that's well and good in the short term. But I actually think we will find ourselves having to go a great deal further, because I think we're at a point where our whole way of thinking based on Enlightenment principles may not itself be sufficient. I think we've got to move beyond, for example, to the adoption of complexity science, really ask serious questions about whether or not equality is a false prospectus that simply can't be delivered, and that we need to be looking at fairness, which is a quite different kind of principle. And looking at, and Martin does mention this, and I think it's absolutely crucial and at greatest risk, and that is building practical political structures on Isaiah Berlin's ideas of pluralism. He developed the ideas, but he didn't put forward practical institutions on which they could be built. And our majoritarianism doesn't really help. That was an issue we had to deal with in Northern Ireland. How do you ensure that people can disagree without killing each other? Not how can they agree, but recognizing they will never agree on the good. And how can we find it? That would take us beyond where we have been up until now. And I think that's kind of the challenge that Martin is setting down for us, albeit I think he's also saying it's a bit of a tough nut to take it forward as far as that. But thank you again, Martin, and thanks, Andy, for setting it up.
Very, very welcome. Lord Alderdice is obviously a fan of your book, Martin. Martin, any response to what he's explained?
I think he raises some incredibly important issues. I don't go into the impact of future technologies because it would have probably added another 50 pages, and enough is enough. I'm not an expert. I think our economic situation is, I do stress that our economic situation is structurally very difficult now. There aren't simple solutions. I did make that very, very clear. And some of what is going to happen is terrifying. Your point about pluralism is core. And what I say in my book, which may be a cop-out, is this, is that a democracy requires people to accept that the outcome of elections are legitimate. And there are two reasons why they might accept, three reasons. One, that they basically feel everybody is similar enough in the relevant respects that they can abide by it because they basically trust everybody reasonably well. That's the easiest way. The second way of thinking about it is, well, we've all decided to agree with these rules. And even if we don't like what's happening now, really don't like it, we can live with it because we're going to have another chance later. And the third possibility, which I don't discuss properly, is, well, we really, really, really don't agree with this. And what we need is a political settlement which allows us to live and the way we want to do, and rule by people that we trust, and who cares about the others. And once you get to that last stage, you've gone beyond what I think of as normal democratic politics. If the differences fall neatly on geographical lines, you get independence movements. I don't think I need to point that out in Britain at the moment. If they, however, they don't, because people who differ fundamentally live side by side, you have an enormous problem. I don't discuss this in length, but there's a very interesting recent book, which I reviewed a few months ago by Yasha Monk, who's a German-American democracy specialist on the problems of democracy in diverse societies. And I would have thought, all I would say on that is Lord Alderdice, by virtue of who he is or where he comes from, must know at least 10 orders of magnitude more about those problems than I do. So I will add nothing more on this, except to say they are fundamental and they may get close to the limits of democracy. And I would suggest that, at least in the case that he knows well, what has helped is that it's embedded within a larger state which can provide order. But if it isn't, let's be very blunt, if it isn't, you've got Lebanon. And that's terrifying. I'm not saying, by the way, there is any society in the West that is at risk of that, but historically that has unfortunately and tragically happened.
This is powerful stuff, folks. Very thought-provoking and very, very, very powerful. Thank you very much indeed, Lord Alderdice. And now to Lord Oates, who's also with us. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Martin, for your fascinating introduction. And I'm looking forward to reading the book. I haven't read it yet, but it strikes loads of chords, what you said. And the thing that has worried me is a sort of sense that people increasingly see democracy, or large sections of people see democracy as being about how you get what you want, as opposed to how we broker all our different wants and come to reasonable compromises. And compromise becoming a dirty word in politics, I think, is very, very dangerous for democracy because it's fundamental to it. You talked about the danger of charismatic politics, and I wonder to what extent charismatic politics emerges when there's really a failure of ideas, and then personality and identity take their place. And again, you mentioned important issues like devolution, like the very damaging impact that the dominance of the Treasury has had on our economy over many, many years. Party funding, these issues are all well known. They've all been discussed. I remember, at university, the Treasury dominance was a sort of key thing. It had to be resolved. It's been going on for decades and it never seems to be. And I think, there is that sort of sense that politics it is just not delivering the sort of answers that it needs to. And just my final point, my fear is that what happens in these situations where people give up on politics as a contest of ideas and come to see it as a contest of identity or sort of almost tribal loyalty, is that then democracy gets divorced from issues and one starts to say, oh, right, I disagree with this because of the person saying it is not of my tribe. And I think we're probably all guilty of that. I mean, I think we are less affected than in the States, but certainly I know around the post-Brexit debate, I would react to something and be against it simply because it was being uttered by somebody from the other side, and that is very damaging, I think, to politics, because you don't look at the arguments properly. And how we get out from that, I think, is really important, because as you see in the States, whenever I visit the States, really significant things or insignificant things become just politicized. And if somebody takes a view who's on the Republican side, then as a Democrat, you take a different view. You saw it over masks in a much bigger way than ever happened here, but over lots of different issues. So how we break that cycle, I think, is incumbent on all of us, whether we see ourselves on the progressive side or the sort of right-wing reactionary side. But thank you very much for your insights.
Lord Oates, I personally found what you just said really interesting, and I think I'm going to try to frame that as a question for Martin to respond to. So, Martin, how will we be able to come away from politics that is fundamentally combative and adversarial and divisive and tribalistic. Are we going to come away from that? Because it really turns the people off. We don't want that.
Well, God, there's so much to be said on this. It's not something I discuss at length because it's not a politics tract. This is one, it's rather like my democratic capitalism thing. I call them complementary opposites. So tribalism is both necessary for politics and destructive of it. So life is difficult. That's why is it necessary? Because in order to have a government which is elected, you do need political parties. You need organizations which bring people together that can produce coherent bodies of opinion and policy, which can enact those policies in a legislature, which have members of cabinet who share enough to do things together. Of course, in a war, you can have a war government, and that's completely reasonable because it's a shared situation of national emergency. But in a normal society, we do have differences, and the tribe that people want to rule them will change. And having the, if you like, the offerings of the different tribes is a natural part, a competitive part of democracy. And parties are essential. In the launch party that we had for my book in the London School of Economics, Jesse Norman, MP, made this point very powerfully and talked about the history of parties. And that's come back to what I said about France. So we need parties. I don't think you can organize it effectively otherwise. And the only other way is through the directly elected president. And the directly elected president outside a party framework becomes too easily a tyrant. So we need it. But of course, if it becomes tribalism above everything, that you oppose any idea because it's not yours, and it becomes, then you can, as rightly pointed, you can politicize everything. So almost every aspect of personal life, what you would think of cultural things that really shouldn't be in the political sphere at all, in my view, become part of politics. Master example, vaccinations, for God's sake. And I don't know the solution. My book has perhaps the motto, which would be characteristic of someone of my age, which is a Greek, very famous Greek motto, which I think is the basis of all democratic life, which is civilized life, which is nothing in excess. That is to say, making a complex society and a complex political system is about balancing evils and goods, and you never eliminate them, because often the evils you dislike are a mirror image of things you actually need. And this is, I think, a perfect example. So we need tribalism, but not too much. How do you get that? I don't know. But historically, alas, the thing that has often assuaged domestic tribalism has been war.
Fascinating stuff, absolutely fascinating stuff. We're going to hear from Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. And Baroness Bennett, please do take the opportunity to mention your book, your upcoming book. I would love to do a TTF book club session on it in due course as well. And then we'll start bringing things to a close, folks. Natalie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin and Andy, for arranging this. And apologies for the advert, but it is World Book Day. It's called Change Everything, Common Sense Politics for the Age of Shocks. And I 50% agree with Martin, who I have to say is the FT writer I go to every day to see every time I get a chance to see what he's written, and 50% fundamentally disagree. I agree on the democracy and the crucialness of democracy. Where I think we're seeing what's happened with capitalism is what little democracy there was historically is in the capitalism as it's worked today has mean a few people, a few companies absolutely dominating the economy and everyone else having to do what the boss says. And I think that's one of our foundational problems. But where I think, as the title Change Everything suggests, I don't think we can go back. I don't think what we had in the past worked, and what we had in the past got us to the point where we are today. So I think if you look at the social democratic period after the Second World War, that was built on colonial exploitation, the immiseration of large parts of the world. That was one of the foundations of that. And it was also built on a trade-off where people stopped being involved in what their world looked like and consumed. Then you went to neoliberalism, 70s and onwards. Inequality rose, and we saw greed is good, inequality doesn't matter. So what we need, I would say, is a democratization of the economy, a democratization of people's time, which is why I very much believe in a universal basic income, because people don't have a boss, they don't have a state telling them how to spend their time. They have the time, the choice for themselves. And I think each individual is the best person equipped to decide how they use their time. And I think there's a couple of other things to say, and I'm going to mention a couple of other books. I think we draw on far too narrow a range of ideas of what our society could look like. And I'm going to mention David Graeber and David Wensom's The Dawn of Everything. We have a 200,000-year human history. We've arranged our societies in many, many different ways. And, just to going back on the Greeks and the Romans and seeing this as some kind of inevitable progress the whole world's heading to is deeply dangerous. It's also dangerous that although we might have autocratic politics and quasi-democratic politics, the economies around the world, the brand names, the products, the ways of living, the mobile phones all look the same. And I draw from scientific understandings that lack of diversity is deeply dangerous. And finally, on that point of science, I think we've got to bring science into economics, particularly, and into our politics. And that means we can't keep chasing growth. There are limits to growth, as we also learned in the 1970s. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And we also have to understand that we are hollow bionts. We are actually coalitions of organisms. You consist of about 56,000 different organisms, and we are part of nature. And we have to see our societies as operating within natural systems. So I would say you're absolutely right about blowing up the treasury in a metaphorical sense. You're absolutely right about politics and democracy, but you're wrong that there's any kind of model from the past that can tell us what the future, a sustainable future, can look like. Thanks.
Baroness Bennett, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We're going to pass to Martin now for his final comments before I bring the session to a close. It really has been a very, very thought-provoking session, and it's been wonderful that we've been able to disagree in a very civilized way. That's great. Thank you. Martin, back to you, sir.
I think that in the minute I have, it will be really silly for me to respond or even attempt to respond to what Baroness Bennett has just said. As you might imagine, I agree with her when she agrees with me and disagree strongly where she disagrees with me. I do explain at length why I disagree, and when she reads at length why I disagree, she will dislike it even more, I promise you. I discussed universal basic income and why I think it's a very, very difficult proposal to make work. But let me start from the basic point. I'm profoundly, deeply suspicious of utopianism in all its many forms. And of all the utopianism that we have, there's no doubt, because I agree with a lot of what Baroness Bennett says about our concern about the environment and so forth, that the sort of utopianism she represents is the most attractive. But in my view, that doesn't make it workable, either as near to medium-term politics. We have crises now. We're not going to be able to rearrange the entire world order before we fix them. And I also believe, though I understand the work of David Graeber and so forth, that the sort of society we have is not an accidental version of human society. It is deeply interconnected with the sort of economy and sort of organization we have. And most of the plausible alternatives are not going to be better. They're going to be much, much worse. So I have a view which is rooted in the history of actual revolutions in the last centuries, is that the path to hell is paved with the desire for utopia. So Baroness Bennett will not be surprised that we are on the other side of the fence. But I consider her opposition to my ideas the most valuable we have nowadays. They're rooted in the most profound and legitimate concerns, which we have to deal with without a doubt. And I respect the passion that she has, and people like Carolyn Lucas, who I know, Kate Roworth, with whom I was debating on Start the Week this week, have. They are very important voices, very important voices. We need to listen to them, but I don't agree with them.
It's lovely to hear the word passion there. The Transparency Task Force aspires to be much more than just a talking shop. We want to drive real change. And our strategy for driving change is to bring together those with a sense of passion and purpose for the change we want to see. We've heard from many people like that today who have this sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see, with those who have the power and the position to make change possible. I really don't think we could possibly have squeezed any more into the hour or so that we've all just had, folks. It's been wonderful to hear about your book, Martin. It really has. Thank you so much for setting aside some time for us. And I know it's been an incredibly busy time for you in recent weeks. I'm not at all surprised your book's proving to be remarkably popular. I personally think you've hit on a real nerve. Many people are becoming increasingly concerned about the quality of our democracy, and let's go with that Robert F. Kennedy point about let's continue to challenge what we don't agree with, and this idea of an engaged civil society is really where it's at for me. Let's once again show our appreciation to Martin, folks. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll wrap this session up there. Thank you very much.